The gear audit took place in the mudroom, a space designed to be the transition between man-made comfort and the raw architecture of the Earth. But for the board of Apex Global, it was just another stage for performance. They laid out their equipment with a rhythmic clatter of titanium and high-density polymer, lightweight stoves, emergency beacons with global coverage, and heated gloves that ran on proprietary lithium-ion batteries. Everything was smart. Everything was connected. Some people measured human worth entirely through price tags, and in this room, Elias was the only one who seemed poorly priced. Isabella watched Elias pack his old canvas rucksack. The material was thick, stained with the sap of a dozen different forests, and reinforced with leather straps that had been softened by decades of use. She noticed a small, heavy object wrapped in a piece of oiled silk. "What's that?" Isabella asked, her voice sharp, cutting through the hum of a vibrating satellite phone. "Another feeling you're bringing along?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He unwrapped the silk with a deliberate, reverent slowness that made the high-speed energy of the executives feel twitchy and shallow. The brass of the compass caught the morning light, glowing with a dull, honest luster. It was heavy, a solid anchor of metal and glass. "It was my father's," Elias said, his voice a low vibration. "He was a ranger in this range for 40 years. It's never glitched. It's never run out of power. It's the only thing that's never lied to me." Isabella reached out and touched the brass with a manicured finger, her diamond ring clicking against the casing. She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed off the lockers. "Mr. Graves, this is a museum piece. You're leading the most powerful board in the tech sector into a high-risk environment, and you're relying on a needle and a magnet? This is exactly why your industry is dying. You cling to the past because you're terrified of a future you can't control." She pulled her Apex 9 from her belt, the sapphire screen glowing with a crisp, multicolored topographical map. "This unit has a triple redundant signal. It accounts for orbital drift and gravitational anomalies. It has a built-in emergency medical triage AI that can diagnose a heart attack from my pulse. Your compass, it just points north. It doesn't tell you how to survive the journey." "Pointing north is usually enough," Elias replied, his voice devoid of ego. "If you know who you are, the mountain will tell you the rest." "Typical," Isabella muttered, turning to her team. "The problem with the old guard is that they mistake stubbornness for wisdom. Leave the nostalgia in the locker, Elias. We move in 10 minutes." Elias turned to Arya. He knelt in the dirt of the mudroom, his massive frame shrinking to her level. The scent of pine and old leather moved with him. He didn't say "I love you" in the standard arrangement of words. That wasn't his language. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small, carved wooden owl, its surface polished by his thumb. "Watch the sky, Firefly," Elias whispered. "If the owl's eyes turn gray in the light, you tell the lodge manager to close the heavy shutters. The static is coming." Arya tilted her head, her eyes wide and unnervingly knowing. She touched the brass compass in his hand one last time. "Bring the needle home, Daddy. Don't let the white sleep take you." Caleb stood up. He didn't look at the luxury vehicles or the high-end gear. He looked at the horizon, a jagged purple line where the mountains met a sky that was starting to look like bruised skin. He knew what the board did not. He knew that technology had taught them how to ignore the world, and the world was about to remind them that it was still there. The first 3 hours were a study in elite hubris. Isabella led the group with an aggressive, rhythmic pace, her eyes constantly flicking to the Apex 9 on her wrist. She treated the trail like a spreadsheet, a metric to be conquered and optimized. The board members followed, their synchronized breathing the only sound in the thin air, their faces set in the grim determination of people who were used to winning by attrition. "Alignment," Isabella barked over her shoulder as they reached a high plateau. "Keep the spacing. We're 10 minutes ahead of the projected waypoint. Efficiency is the only way to the top." Elias walked at the rear, the invisible anchor. He didn't look at a screen. He looked at the way the pine needles were laying, flat and pointing leeward. He looked at the mountain goats, no longer grazing on the ridges, but huddling in the deep crevices of the rock. He smelled the air, a sharp metallic scent that suggested the ozone was being crushed by an incoming wall of pressure. The air grew heavy, thick with a charge that made the hair on the back of Elias's neck stand up. "Ms. Montgomery," Elias called out. The wind was picking up now, a low, ominous moan that seemed to come from the stone itself. "The pressure is dropping too fast. That gray in the west isn't just clouds, it's a vacuum of ice. We need to turn back to the timberline while we still have visual landmarks. The ridge will be a death trap in 30 minutes. Isabella didn't even slow down. She held up her wrist, the blue light of the GPS reflecting in her goggles like a digital soul. "My array shows the front is moving north-northeast. It'll miss this ridge by 15 miles. Stop being a coward, Graves. You're paid to guide, not to provide a weather commentary. Keep moving." "I'm paid to keep you alive," Elias said, his voice tightening for the first time. "And right now you're walking into a furnace of cold." "Then keep up," Isabella snapped. Wealth had taught her that the world was a resource to be managed, but the mountain was not a stakeholder. It was an entity. As they ascended, the temperature began to plummet. It wasn't a gradual cooling. It was a sudden, violent theft of warmth. The air turned brittle, crackling with static. The executives stopped their chatter. The silence of the mountain began to feel like a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that suggested the earth was holding its breath. Isabella checked her GPS again. She stopped. She frowned. The green line was flickering, dancing erratically across the map like a dying heartbeat. "Elias, why is the signal degrading? We're in the open. There are no obstructions." "Magnetic interference," Elias said, stepping up to the front, his boots leaving heavy, honest prints in the hardening snow. "There's a solar surge hitting the upper atmosphere. The ionosphere is screaming. Your redundant signals are being scrambled like eggs in a pan. The satellites can't see through the fire in the sky." "Impossible!" Isabella hissed, her voice trembling slightly. "This is military grade. It's shielded." Suddenly, the sky didn't turn dark. It turned gray, an absolute featureless gray that erased the horizon in seconds. The first snowflake hit Isabella's goggles. Not a soft flake, but a jagged shard of ice that felt like a needle against her skin. And then, the world vanished. The blizzard did not arrive with a warning. It arrived with a roar. One moment they were standing on a shelf of granite. The next, they were inside a white washing machine. The wind hit 70 miles per hour in a heartbeat, a physical wall of air that knocked Julian to his knees. The sound was a percussive assault, a constant, low-frequency thrum that made the teeth ache and the lungs struggle to find oxygen in the thin, freezing air. "Isabella!" Julian screamed, his voice barely a thin reed against the gale. "The beacon! Trigger the emergency beacon!" Isabella lunged for the emergency SOS button on her Apex 9. Her fingers, encased in battery-heated gloves that were already beginning to lose their warmth, fumbled with the sapphire glass. She pressed the red icon. Nothing happened. The screen flickered a sickly bruised purple, then went black. She flipped the protective cover on her satellite phone, a device advertised to connect from the bottom of the Mariana Trench to the craters of the moon. The display was a chaotic mess of shifting geometric lines and digitized snow. "It's the storm," Isabella yelled, the words freezing on her lips. "The solar event. It's ionizing the air. Everything is shorting out." In sub-zero temperatures, the delicate chemistry of lithium-ion batteries becomes sluggish and defiant. Combined with the magnetic surge of the auroral event, the electronics were being fried from the internal circuitry outward. One by one, the smart gear of the elite began to fail. The heated gloves went cold. The emergency beacons went silent. The digital maps, with their beautiful topographical overlays and real-time tracking, evaporated into shards of black glass. Isabella Montgomery, a woman who had built her entire life on the connectivity and predictability of the modern world, was suddenly, terrifyingly alone in a vacuum of information. She looked at her wrist, then at the sky, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps that turned into jagged crystals on her collar. The silence of the dead technology was more frightening than the scream of the wind. "Elias!" Isabella shrieked, her composure shattering like a dropped mirror. "Where is the trail? I can't see the markers. I can't see my own feet." The group huddled together, a shivering cluster of expensive, high-tech fabric in a white abyss. Panic began to ripple through them, the raw, primitive fear of creatures who realized they were no longer at the top of the food chain. Wealth had taught them how to buy their way out of inconvenience, how to leverage capital against catastrophe, but the mountain did not accept wire transfers. Elias Graves stepped into the center of the trembling circle. He was the only one who didn't look like he was vibrating with terror. His breathing was a slow, deep, and measured metronome. He reached into the inner pocket of his canvas jacket and pulled out the circular brass case. He didn't look at it immediately. He stood still, his eyes closed, his head tilted. He was listening to the wind, the way it whistled through the jagged granite teeth of the ridge. He was feeling the tilt of the rock beneath his boots, reading the braille of the earth through the soles of his feet. He flipped open the compass. The needle spun wildly for several seconds, caught in the magnetic chaos of the upper atmosphere, before it resisted the sky and locked onto the heart of the planet. It shivered, then held. "Death's throat is 1/2 mile east," Elias said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a frequency that anchored the air. "If we stay on this ledge, the wind chill will stop your hearts in 20 minutes. We have to move." "East?" Isabella gasped, her goggles frosted over, her face a mask of frantic denial. "The GPS waypoint said the lodge was west. You're going to lead us off a cliff." "You're guessing, Elias. I saw the map before it died." Elias looked at Isabella. The look wasn't one of anger or triumph. It was the profound, chilling pity of a man watching a blind person argue about the color of a shadow. He reached out and grabbed the front of Isabella's jacket, pulling her close until their goggles touched. "Your GPS is a dead piece of plastic, Isabella," Elias hissed, his breath a white cloud that disappeared into the void. "My compass is a piece of the Earth's marrow. Choose who you want to follow, but choose now. I don't have enough warmth left for an argument, and neither do you." Elias turned and began to walk into the whiteout. He didn't look back to see if they were following. He knew the mathematics of the situation. He knew that Isabella's arrogance had been her only armor, and now that the armor was gone, the woman underneath was as fragile as a winter leaf. Isabella looked at her dead Apex 9. She looked at the gray void where her multi-billion-dollar empire used to be. Then, with a shivering sob that she would later deny in every boardroom, she stepped into Elias's heavy, honest footprints. And if you still believe that character matters more than the gear you carry, take a second to subscribe to the channel and join our community of storytellers. The trek through Death's Throat was a descent into a waking nightmare. The pass was a narrow vein of rock where the wind was funneled into a jet stream of ice. Every step was a battle against gravity, and the overwhelming urge to simply lie down and let the white sleep take over. Sarah was weeping now, a silent, frozen stream of tears that turned to ice on her cheeks before they could even fall. The other board members moved like zombies, their elite bodies failing them as the adrenaline was replaced by the slow, creeping lethargy of stage 1 hypothermia. Isabella was the worst of them. Without her digital crutches, her sense of direction was non-existent. The world was a flat, gray plain, devoid of the hierarchies she understood. She stumbled, falling into the deep drifts, her $2,000 boots filling with snow that felt like molten lead. "I can't," Isabella gasped, collapsing against a frozen pine that looked like a skeletal hand reaching out of the earth. "I can't feel my legs. Elias, we have to stop. Call for a rescue. Use the satellite phone again." Elias stopped. He walked back to Isabella and hauled her upright with a strength that felt like it belonged to the stone itself. "There is no rescue, Isabella," Elias said, his voice as cold as the wind. "There is no board of directors. There is no stock price. There is only the needle and the next 10 steps. If you stop, you die. And if you die, I have to explain to my daughter why I let a coward freeze on my mountain, because she couldn't handle a world without a screen. Do you want to be the reason Arya cries?" The mention of the little girl seemed to pierce through Isabella's fog. She looked at Elias's face, the grit, the grease, the absolute lack of fear. She realized that Elias wasn't protecting them because of the fee. He was protecting them because it was his nature. "I called you a relic," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling. "I am a relic," Elias replied, turning back to the wind. "That's why I'm still standing when your world is in pieces. Move!" They crawled. They slid. They moved through a world where time had lost its meaning. Elias would stop every 100 yards, shielding the brass compass with his body, checking the needle. He would then look at the bark of the trees they passed, feeling for the thickness of the moss on the north side, cross-referencing the magnetic truth with the biological one. Isabella watched him. She saw the way Elias touched the trees, not as resources to be managed, but as elders to be consulted. She saw the quiet competence she had spent her life trying to simulate with branding and public relations. Here, in the whiteout, there was no brand. There was only the truth of the steel needle. By the 6th hour of the storm, the group reached a fork in the ravine. To the left, the path looked wider, a gentle slope that seemed to lead toward lower ground. To the right, a narrow, jagged crack in the rock that looked like a trap. "The lodge is down there," Julian shouted, pointing left. "I remember the map. The valley is that way." Isabella looked at Elias. The CEO was no longer leading. She was waiting for a verdict. Elias held the compass level. The needle was pointing toward the narrow crack. He knelt down and brushed the snow away from a rock, pointing to a small patch of pale green lichen growing in a sheltered crevice. "The lichen grows toward the moisture of the valley, and the wind is coming from the left," Elias said. "That gentle slope, it leads to the edge of the hanging falls. If we go that way, we walk off a 400-foot drop in the dark." The map was drawn by people sitting in warm offices. The mountain is a living thing, and right now, it's telling us to go through the crack. They entered the jagged pass. It was so narrow they had to move in single file, their xomange, shoulders rubbing against the stone. The wind roared through the gap, a sound like 1,000 freight trains, but the rock walls provided a marginal shelter from the worst of the ice. Isabella followed, her hand resting on the back of Elias's rucksack. She felt the vibration of Elias's footsteps through the rock. She realized that for the last 20 years, she had been leading people toward the gentle slope of quarterly profits, never checking to see if there was a cliff at the end. She had been a woman of the map, but Elias was a man of the mountain. Suddenly, Elias stopped. The wind had changed. It was no longer a shriek. It was a low, hollow moan. "We're here," Elias said. Through the swirling white veil, a shape began to solidify. It wasn't the jagged edge of another precipice or the skeletal remains of a frozen forest. It was a low, stubborn geometry of unpeeled cedar logs, tucked so deeply into the leeward side of a granite outcropping that it looked like a growth of the mountain itself. This was not the Obsidian Ridge Lodge. There were no heated floors, no staff waiting with warm towels, and no floor-to-ceiling glass to separate the elite from the environment. This was a trapper's line shack, a primitive notch of survival carved into the world by men who knew that when the mountain spoke, you listened. Elias stepped to the door and kicked a 3-foot drift away from the threshold. He didn't turn to look at the board members as they stumbled toward the dark entrance like ghosts seeking a collective grave. He put his shoulder into the heavy oak door, the hinges groaning with a sound like a winter lake cracking, and ushered them into the dark. The interior was absolute blackness, smelling of cold ash, dry wool, and the ancient heavy scent of cedar oil. The wind, which had been a screaming predator for 7 hours, was suddenly reduced to a distant muffled vibration outside the thick logs. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a physical presence, a heavy, airless weight that made the socialites gasp as their lungs tried to adjust to the lack of movement. Elias didn't wait for them to recover. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who could navigate a room by the memory of its shadows. He found the stone hearth. Within minutes, the rhythmic snick-tink of flint against steel echoed through the cabin. A spark landed on a bed of dry birch bark. A tiny, fragile orange glow blossomed, casting long, wavering shadows across the hand-hewn rafters. As the flame caught a handful of cedar shavings, the light hit the faces of the Apex Global board. They looked like a collection of broken dolls. Sarah was slumped against a woodpile, her $2,000 jacket shredded at the shoulder, her eyes vacant and rimmed with frost. Julian and the others sat in a row on a low wooden bench, their heads bowed, their expensive, battery-failing gear steaming in the cabin's temperature as it began its slow, agonizing climb. Isabella Montgomery stood by the heavy door. She looked at the room, the hand-carved furniture, the old wool blankets, the total lack of a single glowing screen or digital interface. She looked at Elias, who was now feeding larger logs into the fire, his hands steady, his movements a symphony of quiet competence. Isabella reached into the pocket of her tactical vest. She pulled out the Apex 9 satellite navigator. The sapphire glass was cracked. The internal sensors were still trying to find a signal that didn't exist in a world where the ionosphere was on fire. She stared at the dark screen, then at the orange light reflecting off the brass compass on the table. Without a word, Isabella walked to a small wooden crate by the door used for discarded waste. She let the $5,000 device slip from her fingers. It hit the bottom with a dull, hollow plastic thud. "It didn't even tell me the temperature," Isabella said. Her voice was no longer the smooth, disruptive baritone of the boardroom. It was a jagged reed, thin and stripped of its polish. Elias looked up from the fire. He didn't gloat. He didn't point out the irony. He simply picked up the brass compass and held it in the palm of his hand, the metal glowing with an honest, humble luster in the firelight. "It told you exactly what you needed to know, Isabella," Elias said quietly. "You just didn't like the answer, because it didn't come with a progress bar. Technology has taught you how to ignore the truth, but the mountain just showed you the receipt." The long night passed in a silence that was no longer ngot, suffocating. It was a cleansing silence. Isabella watched Elias move about the cabin, performing the small, necessary tasks of survival, melting snow in a cast-iron pot, steeping pine needles for tea, checking the seals on the windows. He did it all with a grace that required no audience, no stock price to validate his efficiency. "I have a son," Isabella said suddenly, her voice cracking the silence like a dry branch. She was staring into the embers, her knees pulled up to her chest. "He's 20. I haven't spoken to him in nearly a year. He wanted to work in reforestation, digging in the dirt for minimum wage. I told him he was wasting a Montgomery education. I told him he should be building algorithms to predict the market, not planting trees to save a world that's already burning." Elias paused, the ladle in his hand. He thought of Arya sitting back at the lodge, drawing her map with a pencil that never ran out of power. "Scaling isn't the same thing as surviving, Isabella," Elias said, his voice a steady anchor in the dark. "A mountain doesn't scale. It just is. Your son." He was trying to learn the language of the ground. Perhaps he knew that eventually everyone has to return to it. Maybe you should have listened to him. Isabella bowed her head. A single honest tear fell onto the cedar floorboards, disappearing into the dust. "I've spent my whole life building a tower of glass. I thought I was leading the world into the future, and in 6 hours, a bit of wind turned it all into a graveyard of expensive toys." "The wind didn't do that," Elias said, handing her a cup of hot, bitter tea. "Your ego did. The wind just turned the lights off so you could finally see where you were standing." By the next morning, the storm had broken with a suddenness that felt like a divine pardon. The sky was a vast, indifferent blue, the kind of blue that only exists after a great cleansing. The mountains stood in a brilliant, blinding white, looking as pristine and untouchable as the day the world was made. A rescue helicopter from the National Guard arrived at 09 hours, its rotors kicking up a spray of diamond-like ice crystals that danced in the crisp air. As the board members were assisted toward the craft, looking like survivors of a war they hadn't known they were fighting, Isabella Montgomery stopped at the cabin door. She looked back at the small cedar structure, then at Elias Graves, who was standing in the snow, his canvas rucksack on his back, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the lodge was finally visible. Isabella didn't offer a handshake. She didn't offer a business card or a consulting fee. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the gold-leafed fountain pen she had used to sign multi-billion-dollar merger agreements, and set it on a flat granite rock. It looked small and absurd against the vastness of the Rockies. "Elias," Isabella said, her voice steady for the first time in years. "Thank you for the needle. I think I finally know which way north is." Elias gave a single slow nod. A look of profound, quiet respect passed between them, the look of two people who had stood in the dark and realized they were made of the same mortal clay. The return to the Ironwood Summit Lodge was a surreal experience. The fortress of glass looked different now, fragile, transparent, and slightly ridiculous. Arya was waiting on the porch, her oversized sweater flapping in the cold draft. The moment she saw her father, she sprinted across the snow. Elias caught her, swinging her into the air, his laughter a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo off the peaks. "The owl's eyes turned gray, Daddy," she shouted into his neck. "I told the lodge manager. I told them to close the heavy shutters because the static was coming." "I know you did, Firefly," Elias whispered, closing his eyes. "I heard you in the wind." 2 weeks later, the financial world was rocked by a headline that no one had predicted. Isabella Montgomery resigns as CEO of Apex Global. The statement was brief, unembellished, and carried the resonance of a woman who had finally found her own pulse. It stated that she was stepping down to pursue personal alignment, and that 60% of her personal wealth was being transferred into the Graves Legacy Trust, a foundation dedicated to the preservation of the mountain wilderness and the education of children in the ancient arts of the earth. Isabella moved to a small cabin in the Pacific Northwest, far from the glass towers and the fiber-optic hum of the city. She started a garden. She started talking to her son again, learning the names of the mosses and the lichens that grow in the cracks of the world. And on her desk, in a small glass case, sat a single object. It wasn't a trophy or a plaque. It was a battered brass compass with a scratched lid. It was a reminder that in a world of satellite arrays and high-speed algorithms, the most valuable thing a person can own is the humility to know which way is truly north. Elias Graves continued to guide. He didn't raise his prices. He didn't buy a new truck. He still wore the same faded canvas jacket with the oil-stained cuffs, but every Saturday morning he would sit in the forest with Arya, teaching her how to read the clouds, how to listen to the birds, and how to trust the needle. Because he knew that the storm would always come again. And he knew that when the lights of the city finally went dark, the only thing that would remain would be the truth of the brass and the strength of the soul. True wealth isn't measured by the logo on your suit, but by the weight of your character when the world thinks you are invisible. And sometimes, the most valuable thing you own is the name you refuse to sell for any price. In the end, the mountain didn't take anything from Isabella Montgomery. It just showed her what she had already lost, and it gave her the only thing worth finding: